Okay, hello everyone. Good morning for those in UK. Good afternoon, good evening actually for those in China. Welcome to Oxford Prospects and the Global Development Institute in Conversation events. I am Shidu Wang, Director of the Institute at Regent's Park College, Oxford University. This term, we launched this Restoring series with experts from law, international affairs, environmental science, and economics. And we try to focus on some of the challenges in the current global context beyond the pandemic. Drawing upon their research and professional practice, we hope to understand better the complex nature of conflicts and divisions. And hopefully, it can enable us to think more deeply and act faster on many challenging issues, some of which can perhaps be transformed into opportunities for building back better and restoring global cooperation. Today's topic is UN Decades on Ecosystem Restoration, which plays a significant role in restoring climate stability. Thanks to the development of science, we are confident that the pandemic will be over sooner or later, even though we know that the pandemic being seen as a crisis of this generation. However, what's more challenging this century for all humankind, and hopefully it can make the whole world coming together, is no doubt the climate change. As today is now my role to introduce our two distinguished panelists, I'm delighted to introduce our host today, Professor Xiaofan Yang from Beijing Normal University. As Professor Xiaofan Yang is currently a professor in Earth System Science at Beijing Normal University. Her research interests include hydrology and water resource, soil and water pollution, ecosystem function. Professor Yang has published more than 16 research articles on scientific journals. She has been the PI of research projects funded by the government industry in both China and US. She is also the national representative of International Arctic Science Committee. She holds an engineering degree from Tsinghua University in China and a master's degree from Royal Institute of Technology, Sweden. She also holds a PhD from Kansas State University in the US. Before joining BNU, I suppose Professor Yang had been working more than 10 years as a scientist in the US Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Before we get on with that, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is in partnership with the Beijing Normal University. I want to give my special thanks to the support from colleagues like the Executive Dean of China Institute of Education and Social Development, Professor Song Shanping, as well Dr. Liu Lengxin from BNU International Exchange Office. Okay, I think that's pretty much a lot of introduction rather than overtaking so much time from the panelist discussion. Let me welcome and give the floor to Professor Xiaofan Yang. Here you are, Xiaofan.
Thank you, Shudong. My name is Xiaofan Yan, and I really appreciate the opportunity afforded. And I'd like to give special thanks to Dr. Shudong Wang as well for making this happen, and also his continuous efforts in UK-China Conversation series. And I thank all the guests and the audience for joining us today. Since today is still Chinese Spring Festival, we also would like to send our best wishes to the world. So let's start our topic today. Transforming our world towards sustainability addresses implementation of the SDGs and also requires advanced understanding of environmental degradation and climate change as both social and political issues. Adopting an eco-social lens in policy design can facilitate not only green, but also fair approaches that will be required to achieve the SDGs. And it will help us minimizing the risk of injustice associated with green economy policies and redress the distributional impacts of environmental and climate change policies in favor of vulnerable groups. Eco-social policy brings together participatory governance and decision-making, progressive social policies and environmental regulation with local initiatives and innovations to promote equitable and sustainable outcomes. Many challenges and open questions are actually being confronted today, and our discussion will focus in particular on interpreting knowledge and information between scientists and the policymakers under the theme of ecosystem restoration, global sustainability, and also climate change. And I'm delighted to introduce the following two speakers today. Professor Denny Snower is a senior research fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford University, as well as a non-resident fellow of Brookings Institution and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. Professor Snower is founder and president of the Global Solutions Initiative and professor of macroeconomics and sustainability at the Hertie School in Berlin. He was president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and in 2017, he was made co-chairman of the officially mandated Think 20 engagement group, advising the German G20 presidency. He holds a BA and an MA from New College, Oxford, and an MA and a PhD from Princeton University. And prior to becoming president of the Kiel Institute, he was professor of economics at Birkbeck College, University of London. And Professor Friederike Aldo is Associate Director of the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford, and an Associate Professor in the Global Climate Science Program. She is the co-lead of the World Weather Attribution, pioneering rapid attribution studies in an international effort to analyze and then communicate the possible influence of climate change on extreme weather events. She was named one of New Scientists' Ones to Watch, and in 2020, climate change attribution was named one of MIT Tech Review's top 10 breakthrough technologies. And also in 2020, she became one of 10 international climate scientists to join the core writing team of the IPCC, which will be released next year, I assume. And her work has been featured extensively in global media in different ways. So the first session of today's event comprises two lightning talks from our distinguished speakers. At first, Professor Snower will deliver his talk titled Social Foundations for Environmental Policy. And now let's welcome Professor Denny Snower.
I'm absolutely delighted to be in this august crowd and would love to introduce my topic in a rather unconventional way. As an economist, I'm used to dealing both with academics who look at environmental economic models, as well as giving advice to policymakers from an economic standpoint regarding the environment. So the exchange between the economy and the environment is central to the work of this group of people that I've been associated with. One thing that has been missing in much of the literature, as well as the discussions with policymakers, is the social side. And that has been of increasing concern to me because the successful environmental policy, both with regard to climate change, but also with regard to environmental degradation more generally, needs the public compliance. And therefore, the social side is absolutely essential, and it also needs compliance from business. And therefore, it is not sufficient simply to focus on policy instruments. There's been lots of discussion about carbon taxes, emissions trading, and so forth. And I think everyone is reaching the conclusion that there are many different systems, but they're very broadly translatable into one another. And since, with regard to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are a global problem, it clearly needs a global solution. And therefore, it's absolutely necessary for these different policy initiatives in different governments to come into some alignment with one another. That, as a matter of equity, you should have more or less the same implicit carbon price across all countries of the world. But then there is a matter of equity, which is how are resources to be distributed. And there are different policies like carbon taxes, trading emissions rights have very, very different implications. And bringing them to the fore to discuss equity and efficiency alongside one another has clearly been a big advantage and enriched the policy debate. But it completely leaves us blindsided with regard to the role that the private sector, business and civil society should play. And that is what I would like to focus on in the minutes that remain. Last year, we, for the first time, put together the first normatively based index of well-being that spans all the G20 countries and a good number of countries now. There are well over 150 countries worldwide. Collects these data on an annual basis over longer periods of time for all these countries. And it covers fundamental human needs and purposes that occur across nations and cultures. And let me summarize what they are. The first is solidarity, which is measures of the degree to which one is socially embedded. To what degree do you feel, part of a social group that offers you support, but also gives you opportunities for giving. And that is a basic social need. Everybody knows that humans are social animals, but that does not play much of a role in economic policy. And looking at social solidarity can be measured in a wide variety of ways. Giving behavior, willingness to help strangers, donating money, volunteering time, trust in other people can be measured, social support, how many friends and relatives do you have whom you can count on in times of trouble. So there's a lot of survey evidence across many countries that can be taken. So solidarity can in principle be measured with the same regularity as GDP. And we've measured it, and it's not at all well correlated with GDP at all. And then the next one is agency, which is your ability to determine your destiny through your own efforts, a sense of empowerment. And a lot of sub-indices go into that, such as labor market insecurity, numbers of people vulnerably employed, life expectancy, years in education, confidence in empowering institutions, and so on. And there too, you can construct indices with the same regularity as GDP. And then there is, of course, GDP, which is material gain and its distribution, inequality, and so forth. Incidentally, solidarity and agency, their distribution also needs to be looked at carefully. And lastly, there's environmental sustainability, measured broadly through something like the Environmental Performance Index, can be decomposed into a lot of sub-indices. So we've got solidarity, agency, GDP or material gain, and environment, SAGE. So it's come to be called the SAGE, like wisdom index of understanding the degree to which economies are coupled with society. And so the underlying vision there is we have the environment, our planet. And within the environment, we have the sum total of all persistent human relations, and we call that society. And within that, we have institutional forms of interrelations together with the organization of power relations, and that we call polity. And within that, we have the economy, which is driven by social and political rules. So you've got these nested systems, environment, society, polity, and economy. and economic policy needs to take these other things into account. Now, if one interesting thing that has happened is one can look at what has happened over the past 10 years, including the final year with the pandemic, to each of these indices. And it has big implications for environmental policy. And at this point, I think I'd like to share my screen. Just one second. Here we go. Let's have a look. Let's see, just one second. Where are we? Here we are. So you've got this SAGE index for a variety of different countries. And we'll start, since China and the UK are important, with the United Kingdom. And there you can see that the blue line is GDP, which obviously collapsed during the pandemic. Agency has been sort of gone down, been a bit stagnant, and then has grown because relative to the challenge that we face, people felt empowered to do all sorts of things. Whereas solidarity has taken a nosedive. And solidarity consists of two things, inward solidarity and outward solidarity. And inward solidarity is how you are embedded in your communities, inward in the nation, more local communities. Outward solidarity is building bridges to people who are unlike you, different nations, and so forth. So public support for multilateralism has gone sharply down. In the UK, inward solidarity has fared reasonably well, but outward solidarity has fallen. And you can see we have these plots where we have these four different indices: solidarity up on top and agency down below, and material gain, GDP, on the left, and then the environmental protection index on the right. And you can see that in terms of the red line is 1920 and the blue line is where we were, 2020, and the blue line is where we were in 2010. And you can see that in terms of environmental protection, the UK has shown improvement, but in terms of solidarity, it has definitely gone down. And agency has gone up a bit, and GDP has declined. Now, I don't want to take up much time, so I'm going to flip through these things very quickly. Let me just, I will give you Germany, and then I'll turn to China, and then stop, but just say a few words about the implications. Germany, GDP has collapsed. Once again, agency has risen. It started rising for more than the past year. And solidarity has gone up as well. And they are inward, that's mainly driven by inward solidarity. And you can see these lines do not move in tandem with one another. But solidarity, especially outward solidarity, is absolutely necessary if one wants to make progress on the environment. And here you can see that in Germany, agency, over the past 10 years, there's been particular improvement. There's been regress in terms of solidarity, some GDP growth, and the environment has improved slightly. Now I'm going to skip past France. Here's China. So in China, you see GDP looks quite different. That's well known. It hasn't collapsed like in many other important countries. You can see that solidarity has risen. That is again driven primarily by inward solidarity. Outward solidarity has gone down. and the agency index has slightly declined. So you see a very different development here, and that has sort of big implications. So for a 10-year period, you can see that there has been improvement on all sides relative to the baseline. Obviously, China still has a good amount of development to do, and so in terms of the average of all countries, it's still inside the green square, which is the average across all countries. But if you see that the blue diamond is where you were in 2010, the red one in 2020 lies outside it. So on all sides, there's definitely been improvement. What this means, and this then I'm going to conclude, in terms of preserving the environment, is that solidarity and agency need to be channeled into public compliance with environmental policies. And basically what we need is a multi-level governance approach. At, say, the G20 level, we need, at the UN level, we need to agree on overarching climate and environmental goals. And through the Paris Agreement, that has been done very broadly. But then that needs to be translated into the national level, regional level, and local level. And that is where these social indices become important. Countries where outward solidarity is collapsing, in the United States, for example, under Trump, you do not have much hope that the government will make big strides in terms of multilateralism because it's unpopular. But in addition, agency also needs to be channeled because people on the ground, whether it's business or civil society, need stuff to do in order to become engaged. And only then, I think, will these environmental targets that we set ourselves have any traction across nations. So at a multi-level, from the international level to the local level, we have a lot of global coordination to do. And that inevitably will mean that countries will need to understand that they participate in a global common good with respect to climate. Whereas with respect to other things like water shortages, standard of living, nations are appropriate. And therefore, one needs to be very careful about how to observe the principle of subsidiarity. At what level do we want to tackle any particular challenge? Some of the environmental challenges are definitely local. Climate change is global, and that simply requires global cooperation, and this social side is not to be neglected. Sorry to have run over my time.
Oh, you're fine. Thank you very much, Professor Snower, and thanks for sharing with us the latest data and all the statistics, and those are very interesting charts. And I think we can probably save the questions in our later discussion session. Next, Professor Otto will share her opinions on very interesting topic, angry weather, how climate change is and isn't affecting us. And let's welcome Professor Friederike Otto.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I will, on the face of it, or when you look at it, talk about something very different, but it's actually very much connected what Dennis Snower has just said. Because on the one hand, climate change is global, of course, and when we talk about climate change, we always talk about global mean temperature and the need to globally get to net zero emissions, which of course is absolutely important and true. But global mean temperatures are not killing people directly. It is that climate change manifests locally, very locally actually, through the changes in extreme events and the changes in their frequency and intensity, to changes in sea level rise, and and how much and to what degree these changes in the natural system affect societies very strongly depends on vulnerability, on exposure, on who and what is in harm's way. And so what I'm going to talk about is the knowledge basis that we have on this other side of climate change, not the mitigation side, not the need to cut emissions, but the side to adapt to climate change, to a changing climate that it has already changed. So we have now 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial global mean temperatures, and that has of course affected the world already. But we are very far away from having an inventory of what these impacts of climate change are today on local scales, on regional scales, on the scales where decisions are on adaptation are being made. And so, but we have actually made a lot of progress in the scientific community in the last 5 to 10 years on finding out what climate change actually means in the cities we live in and in the spaces where we need to adapt to. But and so I will very briefly talk about this. So what you can see here on this slide is a schematic of possible weather. So because every extreme weather event or every weather event is always has always multiple causes. It's always a combination of different drivers, just the natural chaotic variability in the climate system. Then there are there's an important role of where the weather system happens. So what's the land underneath a city, forest, have land use changes happened? But then, of course, external drivers, like, for example, increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, can alter the likelihood of extreme events to occur. So we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is warmer, so overall we see a higher likelihood for heat waves. Heat waves are hotter than they would have been without climate change. And occur more often, and the opposite is true for cold waves. But how much hotter, and where actually are heat waves occurring? Do they still occur in the same places where before, or actually affect a much larger part of the country and are critical thresholds? That is not something that we know from looking at global averages or regional averages. That is not something we only can understand when we disentangle how these different drivers locally affect weather events. And this is what we do in the science called event attribution. So where you look at, in the world we live in today, with all the given drivers that we have, the land use changes that have occurred, the aerosol emissions, and of course the greenhouse gases. What is the likelihood of a certain extreme event that we know we are vulnerable to occur? And so you need to look at what's possible weather in the world we live in today. And you might find that a heat wave that has led to large increased mortality, for example, last year in the UK, over 2,500 people died because of a heat wave. And you might find that this heat wave is, in the world we live in today, a 1 in 5 year event. And then we can say, okay, given what's the role of climate change in this event? And because we know very well how many greenhouse gases have been put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we can take these out of the atmosphere of our climate models and then find out what's possible weather in the world that might have been without climate change. And for heat waves in Europe, we find that climate change had played a huge role. And also this is also actually true for China. China is one of the other hot spots where heat waves have really become a lot more likely. So the same event that is a 1 in 5 year event now would have maybe been a 1 in 100 year event, or even less, or even more rare in the world without climate change. And of course we could do the same, not only just say, okay, we look at the influence of greenhouse gases, but we could say, okay, and assume we hadn't changed the land so much, so we have a much less agriculture, but much more forests. How would that have changed the likelihood of this heat wave? And you will probably also find there is an influence of that. And so this science, through this science, which has become, which has sort of, which we are able now to do these kind of studies since about 5 years. So it has been introduced approximately 10 years ago, but only really in the last 5 years, people around the world, scientists around the world have started to really look into the events that have happened and have looked at what's the role of climate change. And here is an overview that every year the news outlet Carbon Brief updates with all the event attribution studies that have looked at different extreme events that have happened in the world and where studies have been done. And you see here in red all the studies where climate change has been found to play an important role. And all the blue ones are the ones where climate change was found not to play a major role. And the gray ones are the ones that were inconclusive. It is very important, though, to highlight that this is absolutely not representative of the extreme events that have happened in the world. It's just the ones where where scientists have done studies. And scientists still predominantly live in Europe, North America, East Asia. And so there are lots of studies in that part of the world, but very few studies elsewhere. And also heat waves are one of the easiest events to simulate. So you have the best data, and they are the ones where we have the best observational data. And heat waves are also the types of events where climate change plays the biggest role. So we see a lot of heat wave studies here, and that is responsible for a lot of the red color. And then, of course, it is very difficult for a scientist to publish a paper with where you found, well, actually, with the tools we have now, we can't answer the question because our data is too bad or our models are not good enough. So that's not a paper that you would get published. And so these gray spots are probably a lot more. But this means, and this is the last slide I would like to show, I have tried to figure out what's the discrepancy between what we know about how climate change is affecting the extreme weather events that cause losses and damages, or have caused losses and damages to our societies, and what we don't know. And so what you see on this map is for all the extreme events that have happened since 2003, there are the death associated with these events in the different countries. And the larger this red circle is, the more deaths have occurred because of extreme events in the country. And the circle is always on the capital of the country. And then inside the red circles are black circles. And these black circles are for all the death associated for extreme events for which we know the role of climate change. And you can see in Europe and also in China and also, and in Japan, you see that for most of the death associated with extreme events, we do know whether climate change did play a role in this event and also what this role was. But for a huge part of the world, we actually don't know. And so in order to really not only address climate change in the way, or in the mitigation sense that we stop temperatures from rising even further, in addressing the damage that has already been done and that is going to and continues to be done through the climate change we already have. There's still a lot of knowledge that we don't have, and where we do have tools available now to change that, but there is still, climate science is still a very much a system coming out of colonialism, and that is very much represented in who is doing the studies, what is being studied, and in order to really give the people who the agency to do something, to adapt, we also need to have a better, a much stronger emphasis on having a more equitable scientific system and a more equitable way of knowledge sharing across the world in order to adapt to climate change. And yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aldo. That's a really excellent talk. And I think as we progress to our discussion, the second session, I would like to remind the audience that if you have any questions, please click the Q&A button or the chat room button at the bottom of your screen and just type in your questions, and then we'll pick up those questions during our process. We don't have any questions for now, so I'll probably propose one question. And Dr. Otto, I can see on your last slides, you show those circles of death due to climate change. And I noticed that most of the circles are actually from developing countries. And also a key issue appearing during our pandemic is inequity. So what are your views on the developing countries that are in different development stage to achieve a United Nations goal for sustainability? And also if there is a fair approach to resolve this kind of inequity?
Okay, I'll briefly start, but I think for the latter part of your question, I think Dennis Snow has probably more to say than I have. So I think just to clarify, these are not deaths because of climate change. These are deaths because of extreme weather, and whether or not we know what role climate change play. There are of course also deaths within there from climate change, but not all. But
not all of them.
Definitely not all of them.
Yeah.
So I think the reason, whether or not an extreme event is a problem depends to a small degree on how extreme the event is, but to an extremely large degree on vulnerability and exposure. So who and what is in harm's way, and especially in a year of a pandemic, we have seen what compounding risks are, because a big part of vulnerability is, do you have early warning systems of extreme weather events coming? But then if you have the early warning, you also need to be able to do something about it. So if you know there's a hurricane, but you've nowhere to go, then the warning doesn't help you very much. And during a pandemic, a lot of things that used to be possible, like evacuating people, putting them in sports halls, so was then, okay, do we get killed by a hurricane, or do we get ill from the pandemic? And these are, so I think one thing we have definitely learned, or the very hard way this year, is what these complex compounding risks are that scientists have been talking about, and what that actually concretely means, and that it is incredibly more expensive to let them happen than to prepare for them. Expensive not only in monetary terms, of course. And so I think one thing that I would hope we are learning this year is that resilience and preparation is so much better than the alternative, and I hope that we will take that from this.
Sure. But Dennis, do you want to comment on that too? Well, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. Shall we probably?
Okay, go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, shall we pick up those questions? Can you guys see the questions in the Q&A? So Robert Walker is asking Professor Snower, that's a really long question, internal solidarity, nationalism, and the external outward solidarity would seem to be mutually incompatible. And the accepted view is that the shift towards nationalism stems from the perception of lack of agency. And this kind of lack of agency and the nationalism seems to have been exploited to fuel the rising level of international political competition for global influence, illustrated by the West polarized against China. And this in turn seems to undermine the global solidarity necessary to address climate change and environmental degradation. Do you agree?
That is a very perceptive question. One thing that one can say, but these are very, very preliminary findings, is that a lack of solidarity or a drop in solidarity and a drop in agency feeds various populist movements, some of which, many of which are nationalist populist movements, which definitely makes multilateral agreements much more difficult. The idea that, and it's not hard to see how that happens. When people feel that they have little control over their own fate, and when they feel that their local communities are changing or dissolving, and so they don't have a good support mechanism, then what they naturally do is do two things that came out very strongly in the United States and Great Britain over the past few years. They want to build a wall, which is sort of shield themselves from outside influence and take back control, which is the agency side. The building a wall is lack of solidarity, and take back control signals a lack of agency. And so it's certainly true that then you're more likely to be receptive to political leaders who will attribute the problem to foreigners and create divisions, but strengthen social solidarity. And the interesting thing there, the dynamic is concerning, because economists have often said, well, the things that populist politicians recommend, like protectionism, not much emphasis on climate agreements and so on, are things that will hurt the people who are voting for them. And it seems that it is not lack of knowledge. It's not because the people are stupid that they are voting for things that will hurt them, but that which economists think hurt them, which is declining living standard and so on, is only one source of well-being. And if they are promised more solidarity and more agency, then they will gladly sacrifice some of the material gain. And so this is a much more difficult problem. And I think it's largely a problem of communication within countries, whether it's China or the United States or Great Britain. I think the fundamental insight that would help us along would be for politicians to say, we must address each challenge that we face at the appropriate level. So if the level is international, then we must engage in international organizations. And furthermore, you as people should see yourselves as part of a global collective that will all benefit from addressing this global problem. And when it comes to challenges at a national level, then nationalism is appropriate. But you cannot achieve your national goals with regard to global problems if you don't do global cooperation, and therefore outward solidarity and agency with regards to everything outward becomes really important. And that idea is something that has not received sufficient emphasis over the past decade, I believe, although global problems have proliferated.
Okay, I think we have two people asking for the meaning for solidarity index and agency index that you just shown in the figure, and they were asking, why does each country have different development?
Well, that is a really good question with a relatively obvious answer. Everything that you can ask about the solidarity and agency indices, you should ask about GDP. How is it possible that some countries' GDP rises, like in China, and in others it collapses during the pandemic? It's in the United States and Great Britain. Well, I mean, there are really good reasons for it, but the reasons are to be found with regard to solidarity and agency in the social domain, whereas in GDP it's largely in the economic domain, although those two are linked. You need to think about it in the following way. You face a challenge like the pandemic, and then within that, you either feel empowered, all of a sudden, people can do things for one another. I, living in London, have had strangers showing up on our doorstep saying, can we be of any help? That is extremely gratifying as far as I'm concerned with regard to solidarity, but also gives them a big sense of agency. And so you can understand why agency should collapse. But then under other circumstances, you can imagine that this pandemic strikes. You do not really have the infrastructure around. The political arrangements are one that people don't have a lot of confidence in. And so now all of a sudden you feel that your back is really towards the wall, and then agency will collapse. And basically, in failed states, you have collapsing agency and solidarity. And that is, in fact, one of the main reasons why they fail. Providing this infrastructure, and it's partly political and partly social in interaction with one another, partly environmental. If the environment goes unstable, things go belly up. Then one can understand why different countries would react very differently.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Freddie, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. How to determine whether climate change is caused by natural factors or by human factors, and how to determine the contribution value of those factors in extreme climate events?
Yeah, so well, I've shown at the beginning that what we do to find out how which factors play a role in the likelihood and intensity of an extreme event to occur. What we do is we simulate using climate models, different climate models, so which are the same models that are used for the weather forecast, and also statistical models based on weather observations, and then find out how often, how frequent do we get this type of event in these simulations? So what is possible weather in the world we live in today with all the drivers, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but of course also things like ash from volcanic eruptions in the atmosphere, if there was one, or changes in incoming solar radiation, if they had happened. So also all the natural drivers. And then we take one of these drivers out and see, okay, does that change, and how much does that change? What possible weather do we get? And when you look at extreme events, you quite often have that natural causes are as important as greenhouse gases, or even more important. But when you look at things like global mean temperature, when you look at globally, you see that the only thing that has changed that allows us to actually simulate the observed increase in temperatures are the greenhouse gases. So there have been incredibly large numbers of studies with all sorts of models, with all sorts of observations, and it's impossible to explain with our knowledge of physics and also the physical understanding of what a greenhouse gas is and how it works, the rise in temperature that we see without the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Okay, I think we can probably pick up this question from Easy Wait after your comments. Which country would you say has the biggest responsibility to combat climate change and holds the most influence on the issue?
Well, I think responsibility is, of course, a question that is not, you can't answer just scientifically, because there's also a lot of normative aspects in there. But, well, historically, the biggest emitter are the United States. And historically, the earliest emitter is the United Kingdom. So those two are definitely, when you look at the historic responsibility, two of the big players who have a lot of responsibility. And of course, all the developed countries who have enjoyed the benefits of burning fossil fuels for centuries, they have a huge responsibility to help combat climate change. But the problem with the atmosphere is that everyone has to stop burning fossil fuels in order for climate change to stop. And so we need a global collaboration on that, as Dennis Snower has said. We need to stop burning fossil fuels globally. It's not a problem that one country alone can solve, even if they wanted to. But yeah, when you ask from a responsibility point of view, then it's definitely the most developed countries.
Well, talking about specific countries, and we knew that the Biden administration has been back to the table of Paris climate agreement, and will form like an intergovernmental scheme to regulate global efforts to achieve like a sustainable cooperation in a probably robust way.
Sorry, I did not understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, they were asked if like there is an intergovernmental scheme to regulate global efforts to achieve a sustainable cooperation in a robust way.
Okay, I can address that briefly before handing on to Professor Otto. With regard to the G20 is clearly a group that needs to become involved in order for climate goals, UN climate goals, to be transported into action. The G20 obviously does not have authority. It's not a world government, but it is the biggest forum whereby people can align their objectives. Now, that is something that we found relies very interestingly on the narratives that underlie G20 negotiations. Let me simply sort of give one illustration of this. During the German G20 presidency in 2017, before the Hamburg G20 summit, it seemed as if that summit would be the occasion on which multilateralism collapses, because protectionist pressures were rising everywhere. President Trump said he would exit the Paris Climate Agreement. Things were looking very grim. At that point, we had adopted a narrative called recoupling, which is that the G20 should focus entirely on social prosperity, what makes people thrive within flourishing societies. And if economic prosperity becomes decoupled from social prosperity, the G20 should try to recouple economic prosperity with it. And that helped change the nature of the conversation, because one was able to say to the protectionists, you are not the only ones who represent the underprivileged in the world. Quite on the contrary, we are very much concerned with human needs, starting with the needs of the neediest. And protectionism is not a good way to address those needs. And here's a whole series of policy proposals that would do so more effectively. And it's changed the nature of the conversation. Protectionism was stopped. And Germany wrote history at the time, because everything until that time had been decided in consensus by the G20. And once Trump decided to leave the Paris Climate Accord, that should have been taken off the agenda. But Germany said no. 19 countries remain committed. They need to honor their commitments, one country not. And that changed the nature of what it is that the community of nations was meant to do. And climate has not gone off the agenda since then. Even, the Saudi presidency, which was last year, had protecting the planet as one of its 3 priorities. So contributing to a narrative that helps explain why countries are in this together, and that also makes demands on people that your nationalism is not in conflict with multilateralism, but actually complements it, because you can only achieve your national climate goals through multilateral action, is something that should flow into that narrative. And obviously, IPPC has played a really important role in starting such narratives, but on the economic and financial fronts, much more still needs to be done in order just to align countries' objectives.
Thank you, Dennis. I think we have time for one last question. There's an interesting question from Daya Catania, and they're asking, while we talk about the deduction approach or the top-down approach of multinational government level of policies, followed by national, regional, and local level implementation of the policies, is this kind of approach viable for states with large population like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and etc.?
Okay, very briefly, this is something that we do know something about in the Global Solutions Initiative. It has become absolutely clear that top-down alone does not work. It needs a bottom-up component. Bottom-up, like Fridays for the Future, is not going to solve the problem by itself either. And the big job nowadays is to build a bridge between the top-down and the bottom-up. So connecting the narratives of the national leaders with one another, and connecting those narratives with what people think the purpose of their lives are, or what a good life would be at the local level, connecting those things is absolutely critical. And that does not mean that we should have a monoculture of worldviews. You can have a world of very many, different values, different norms, and so on. But nevertheless, the nature of these norms and values permits cooperation across national and cultural boundaries. That, I think, is the sort of really critical thing. Is there something in a national narrative or religious narrative that is an obstacle to cooperation with regard to global problems? When that happens, then we have a very serious problem on our hands. America First with regard to climate is a big no-no, for example. But I'm sure Professor Otto has lots to say.
Well, I think just to add to that, climate change is a problem that can absolutely not be solved by national governments alone, because what needs to happen is that the whole societies and structures of our societies that are built on burning fossil fuels need to change. And that, of course, national governments and legislation is important for that, but that alone will not do it. So Fridays for Futures is one extremely important first step, that it starts the conversation on all levels. But then everyone has their spheres of influence where people can actually change something and really exercise agency. So if you are the head of a school, so you can make your school a carbon neutral school and take these steps. And if you are a CEO of a big business, then of course your sphere is a bit bigger and you can do something with to change the business model. But everyone has their spheres of influence and can make decisions. Some of them are small and some of them are larger, depending on who we are. But it's not a problem that we solve through consume and how it's changing our consume, but it's a problem that we need to solve by changing how we what are the priorities in the decisions we make in these spheres of influences we have, and be that the school or hospitals where we work or whatever it is. But everyone has people who listen to them, and that can be a small or a big group. But changing that is, I think, one of the key things that we need to do and can do, and that actually is crucial for the agency, because that is, well, the big companies like to tell us, so everything you do through your consume. But of course, that actually takes agency away from you, because with your individual consume, you don't change much. But by changing what you do and how you do the other things that you do, and how the whole city approaches consume or approaches school meals or whatever, that is how one can make a real difference. And I think this is something that we need to put a lot more emphasis on.
Thank you, Freddie. We still have a lot of questions that we haven't got time to answer in the Q&A, but I saved them. So I'll probably email you guys those questions so we can probably answer them under the YouTube channel. To conclude our conversation today, I would again acknowledge our two distinguished speakers, Dr. Denny Snower and also Dr. Frederick Gatto. And I really appreciate your enthusiasm and efforts in our event. And also to the audience around the world, and thank you guys for being with us today. And please stay tuned for our following events.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Good night.
Bye.